Hey folks, I'm back with round 3 of the 2021 Las Vegas Open, and I felt pretty good about this game. I thought it was a nice win for me. I was paired against FIDE master Vitaly Bachin, who is around 2350 FIDE, and yeah, I felt like I played pretty well in this game. My opponent played very aggressively, and I was able to kind of neutralize his initiative, I think, in an instructive way. So once again, I went into the game totally blind. The pairings went up pretty much right before the start of the round, and I had no idea who I was playing, so I didn't have a chance to do any preparation. I was on my own. And after e4 was played on the board, I thought for a little while here, just trying to figure out what to do, whether to play e5 or c5 or go back to my trusty one knight c6. After some thought, I ended up deciding to play the Sicilian. I just felt like this was the right time for it, and I could stay flexible based on my opponent's choice here. I could choose different Sicilian variations. And I kind of got a read on my opponent that maybe he wasn't going to go into the big main line open Sicilians. And he ends up going for knight c3 here. So my read on him was somewhat correct, because this move knight c3 is typically connected with white wanting to play either a close Sicilian with g3 or a Grand-Prix attack with f4. And mainly when white is playing this move, they're normally not going to be then going back into the open Sicilian with like knight f3 and d4. So here I decided to play e6. Black has many different moves here, but I've always liked playing e6 against the sidelines in the Sicilian, because a lot of times black gets a very improved version of the French defense. And I used to play the French, so I feel like I have a good experience in these kinds of positions. So he ends up going f4, so we get the Grand-Prix, and now I decide to play a6. Again, black has many moves here like knight c6 and d5. I like starting with this one because it stops bishop to b5, and then black can continue with the plan, knight c6, d5, and one day I can push b5 and put my bishop on b7. So the game continues knight f3, d5, d3, knight c6, and so far I think everything is very normal here. And here my opponent really surprised me with the move bishop to d2, which is one that I've just never seen in this position. I've played it a few times before, and usually what happens is white will play g3 at this point and bishop to g2 and play this kind of like King's Indian attack style of game. But bishop d2, yeah, really caught me off guard. I felt like maybe he's trying to play like queen e2 and castle queenside, but to me, this didn't seem like such a dangerous plan, because black is ready to initiate queenside counterplay very quickly with b5, bishop b7, and so on. So if white wants to put the king on the queenside, I'd be all for it. So after a little bit of time, I just continue my development naturally with knight f6. And if white were to push e5 here, then black could play this normal move knight to d7, where the idea is to push b5, and white doesn't have control over the d4 square. But I think a much better move actually would be this move knight to g8 that I've played a couple times before in similar positions. And the point is to drop back with the knight, but to carve out space on the king side and eventually bring the knight to h6 and f5 and just establish this knight on an absolutely dream square f5, where the knight would just be a monster, and I think black is already to be preferred. Instead, white keeps it flexible with queen to e2, which I think makes a lot of sense. And I decide to go bishop e7, and ultimately I didn't really believe in white's setup here, because at any moment I could play knight to d4 as black, force a trade of knights. I go c takes d4, white's knight would have to move off of c3, and one day the rook on the c file is going to be putting a lot of pressure against the c2 pawn. So having this move in mind at any point, I think gives black just really good chances for the better game here. Now at this point, white finally kind of shows his cards and plays the move h3. And clearly intending to play g4 and just play for the kingside attack. I decide to get my counterplay going with b5. I think black could castle here as well. I don't think it's too dangerous, but I wanted to just stay a little bit more flexible for now. g4 was played. I decide to go bishop to b7. And here white plays g5, which actually surprised me, because I just wasn't expecting him to advance this quickly. Because it is quite an aggressive move. And here I actually spent probably my longest think of the game at this moment, because I really went into the tank trying to figure this one out. My first thought was to just play knight h5, which is kind of like the normal reaction. The knight on h5 threatens to go knight g3, puts a little bit of pressure on f4. It kind of shuts down white's kingside attack. It's like a very normal move. But then I was also considering for a while what happens if I could play d takes e4 here. And I made kind of an interesting error, I would say, in calculation. Because I started calculating this one, and I felt like, okay, if white just recaptures, then I can play knight d7, and I thought this should be more or less fine for black. So then I started thinking like, well, if d takes e4, what about g takes f6? Because I have to make sure that I'm not just losing material here. And the lines actually get kind of funny. So after g f6, e takes f3. If white just takes back, then bishop takes f6. Black is a pawn up. I'm going to play queen d7 to defend the bishop. And I think we just have a fantastic position. One day the diagonal is going to be very difficult for white to deal with. But after e takes f3, white has a couple options. They can consider f takes e7 and f takes g7. Now fg doesn't work because we can't take the queen yet, because the rook is hanging with check and white makes a new queen. But black does have this funny move, bishop h4 check, hitting the king and then forcing white's king to go to d1, where we can now take the queen with check and win the game. So f takes g7 doesn't work. And if f takes e7, then I can take the queen on e2, white takes with check, and at first glance it looks like white is going to be a piece up, but black has this move knight takes d8, taking with the knight and opening up the bishop attack on the rook on h1, and it turns out black is actually winning all of the material back and is going to be up a pawn or two in the end, because the rook is hanging and bishop on f1 is still hanging, and so black is going to be at least a pawn up and just much, much better here. So these lines were, I think, working for black, but then I returned to this position. I kept thinking about, well, okay, if that's not working, then probably white's just going to play d takes e4, and then after knight d7, I kind of talked myself out of liking this position. I thought maybe white could go for an immediate e5 and knight e4, but this actually doesn't work because of knight d4. And if knight takes d4, bishop takes h1, rook is just hanging, and I think black is winning material. But I thought, okay, maybe white will play bishop to g2 first, and then play for e5. And yeah, I think black is better here, but I just ultimately wasn't too sure about this position and ended up not wanting to play it. So I spent a lot of time calculating, these complications after gf6, e takes f3, but kind of for no reason, because I ended up not even going for these lines. I also considered the move knight d7 here, which hangs the pawn on d5, but the point would be to meet this with knight to d4. But here I wasn't so sure this is so great for black either. After takes, knight e4, bishop takes d5, bishop g2. I thought this position is fine for black, but I also thought white has reason to be happy as well with the knight kind of well placed on e4. So after a while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, I ended up just playing knight h5, just my first instinct move. Because I realized, I want to keep the tension in the center. I don't want to clarify things too quickly with d takes e4. If white takes on d5, then I'll happily recapture, and my pawn is controlling the e4 square, and I'm also just going to castle very quickly and put the rook on e8, and white is going to have huge problems on the e-file. So I feel like black's counterattack here is just going to be way too strong. And yeah, I think this actually ends up being a very good decision. Now I'm threatening knight g3, so white plays rook to g1, and now g6. I also thought about castling, but I landed on this move because I wanted to defend the knight. Now the knight is never hanging in case of like knight d4 stuff, and it also plays against white's possible f5 break. Or so I thought, because he actually ends up just playing f5 immediately, which I was again surprised by, but it makes sense at this point. White has started to burn a lot of bridges, and now he kind of goes all in for the attack. But ultimately it just ends up kind of falling short, and I really wasn't too worried at this point about my position. My first idea was actually to play knight d4, which I ended up going for. And the point of this is just to create some counterplay in the center. And I felt like this was now the right time for this move, because after knight takes d4, c takes d4, white's knight on c3 is kicked away from the center, and things are opening up with white's king soon to be stuck on e1. So after knight d1, for example, I was just going to take on e4, take on f5, let's say e takes f5, and then just castle. And now again, the rook is coming to e8, and I think white's position is pretty much busted here, because just totally lacking development. So at this point, I started to feel very optimistic. White started thinking about it for a little bit, and he ends up playing this move e takes d5, so sacrificing the knight on c3. And yeah, I really didn't want to take this knight at first because I felt like, okay, if I can just find something simple here and keep the initiative on my side, I'll be very happy. I did look at this a little bit, but what I didn't like was after bishop takes e3, let's say castles, I'm not really afraid of white taking on e6 or anything like this. I don't think white gets enough pawns, but I didn't like this move, queen e5. Threatening mate, I think I have to play f6, and then something like queen takes e6 check. I move my king somewhere, like king to g7, and this position just felt very messy to me. I thought intuitively that it should be good for black, because I'm threatening like bishop takes d5, for example, but I just wasn't totally sure, and it'd be a shame if I ended up missing something, or maybe white can castle somewhere and just get a big initiative, or take on f6 and open up the g file. It wasn't the clearest position I felt to be walking into, and so I looked for a simpler option, and eventually I just realized that in this position I can just take on f5. So I just take this pawn first, I remove this attacker from white's position, I grab an important pawn, and I also keep the attack on the knight on c3 at a moment where I'm controlling the e4 square, so the knight doesn't really have anywhere good to go to. And if the knight were to just drop back again after knight d1, then okay, again I castle, I have rook e8, bishop takes d5. I think black's position is just excellent, other rook is coming to c8, and this just looked horrible for white. For example, knight f2, I can go queen takes d5, and white can't play queen takes e7 because of rook e8, and white can also not castle because of queen takes a2, and this threat is just way too dangerous. So really I felt like everything was working here for black. This does give white an additional option, which ends up playing queen to e5, but I was quite happy that I ended up choosing this one because I'm essentially I'm sacrificing the pawn because white is going to be able to pick this one up because I just castle here. But after queen takes d4, I felt like black should have more than enough compensation. Number one, I can play b4 and win the pawn on d5, but I end up finding something much, much stronger here, and I start with rook to c8. The point being I'm threatening bishop c5, skewering white's pieces, and now the threat of b4 is actually much stronger because I want to play rook takes c2 after that. And I felt like, okay, white is probably going to play b4 here, because it seems like the only move that defends against both threats. But I was really happy with what I found here, and that is to play rook e8. Okay, very natural move, lining up the rook against the king. But the real point is that after white castles, for example, which I was expecting, then I have a really nice regrouping with bishop f8, bishop to g7, and I shuffle my bishop to the long diagonal, and white is just completely toast on this diagonal. Knight on c3 is super weak, and both rooks are alive, both bishops are super strong, and yeah, I felt like this position is just so much fun for black to play and should be totally winning. And I was thinking something like queen a7 might happen. I'll just go queen d7, rook a8, or bishop g7. And yeah, I feel like there's no way white survives with this this king on c1. So here, white ends up playing king d1, which is another kind of strange move for me. But at this point, it's really hard to suggest something because white's position, I think, is just busted. I think he played this one because he wanted to keep the rook on the a file and maybe get some hopes of counterplay with a4. Again, really hard to suggest something for white at this point. So I just continued with my plan, bishop f8, white played bishop g2, bishop to g7, and now everything is just absolutely hanging on this diagonal. Queen a7, hitting the bishop on b7, and just calmly play rook e7 here, just defending the bishop, threatening a possible discovered attack against the queen, and of course keeping the attack on the knight alive as well. Of course, this knight is pinned to the rook on a1, so yeah, white is just completely lost here. White tried d4. One cute trick I want to point out is that if d6, then there's bishop f3 check, and black picks up the queen on a7. So white tried d4. And I was thinking for a little bit about taking on d5. Then I thought, okay, queen takes e7 is going to happen. Queen takes, knight takes d5. Felt like it should be totally winning for black. White's king is on d1. Pieces aren't really coordinated. But I didn't really want to bother with this. And I looked for something kind of cleaner or more convincing. Then I found, I think, just simple solution, bishop a8, hitting the queen, forcing white to play queen takes a6. And now I can take the pawn on d4. And yeah, everything in white's position is collapsing, and it's pretty much just over here. If d6, then I was thinking I would probably play rook a7. Rook d7 is also good. I can also take on c3 here. So pretty much everything works for black. In the game, white instead played knight takes b5. Now I just start taking material. Bishop takes g1, d6. And here I felt like, okay, black probably has a million good moves, but I wanted to just kind of stay focused, try to be precise until the end. And I was kind of happy with my move here. I was considering rook e6, rook d7, but I ended up going with rook e5. The point being that I'm just putting pressure on the knight on b5, and this is kind of the last piece that's holding white's position together. Now bishop on g2 is hanging. If white takes on a8, I can just recapture, hitting the queen, and then white has a hard time keeping this knight defended. If d7 here, for example, then I can even just play queen takes d7, and then after bishop takes a8, white won some material, but bishop e3 is just totally game over on the d-file. So yeah, after rook e5, my opponent resigned, and that was the end of the game. I felt, like I mentioned, very good about this one. I thought I neutralized white's attack really nicely and played a very decent game for the Sicilian. Yeah, so that puts me on 3 out of 3 in the tournament. Tomorrow I'll be playing round 4, probably against one of the grandmasters in the tournament. So that is, of course, going to be a really tough game. But, you know, I'll do my best, and then I'll be back here to share all my thoughts and how all the action went down. So thanks so much for tuning in. Please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.